If you can really sing in French, I'll give you a contract." The producer mocked, and the whole room burst into laughter. No one imagined that the tired-eyed waitress with a gentle voice would turn that humiliation into the most unforgettable moment in New Orleans. Sometimes, all it takes is one act of courage to silence an entire world. Subscribe to the channel and discover how shame turned into victory. There was something about Amélie that time could never erase. Maybe it was the way she moved between the tables, light steps, almost floating, like someone afraid of being noticed, yet secretly longing to be seen. At Le Jardin Bleu, a French restaurant in New Orleans frequented by millionaires, no one paid attention to the black waitress with sad eyes. She knew that. She knew her light blue uniform and neatly pressed apron were her cloak of invisibility. But as the cloth slid over marble tables and the glasses chimed like crystals of indifference, something inside her stirred. Singing was her secret, her quiet refuge. The French words escaped her lips like a sigh, soft, hidden, as if she were speaking to God and didn't want to be interrupted. Her routine was a tired choreography. Step carefully, smile just enough, lower her gaze when the boss walked by. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir. Right away, sir." Automatic phrases, like her life had been written by someone else's script. Sometimes, she wondered if she was born to serve, or if the world had simply decided that was her role. When sadness pressed too hard, she thought of her mother, the woman who spoke of Paris as if it were paradise. It was her mother who taught her to pronounce liberté like someone tasting hope. But freedom always seemed to live on another continent. Amélie had a voice few ever heard, and maybe that's why she sang so softly. The French words danced among the dishes and candle flames, hidden beneath the clinking of silverware. No one knew that her voice carried more than melody. It carried memories. It carried the echo of a time when life still felt possible. Some guests would glance up for a second, curious, but soon went back to their expensive wines and shallow conversations. The world seemed too busy to notice gentleness. Sometimes, after closing time, Amélie stayed alone in the dining room. She would wipe down the already clean tables just to have an excuse to sing without fear. It was the only moment she didn't feel small. Her voice echoed off the walls and came back to her like a hug. "La vie en rose," she would whisper, smiling as tears insisted on falling. It was strange. The stronger her voice grew, the more her heart seemed to crumble inside. But singing was resistance. And to resist, for her, was an act of self-love. She had no idea how much her quiet presence affected others. Some of the staff admired her from afar, unsure how to express it. There was something different about her, a serene dignity, a strength disguised as sweetness. "You should be on a stage, not cleaning tables," a waiter whispered one night. Amélie only smiled shyly. "Stages are for those the world chooses to see," she replied. Without knowing it, she had just spoken her own destiny. The restaurant was an upside-down stage. The lights weren't for her, and the applause never came. But Amélie knew, even invisibility comes at a price. Being unseen hurt, but it also protected her. No one can humiliate what they don't see, she thought. Still, deep inside, she dreamed of being heard just once, only once, to prove that even a silenced voice could make the world stop. Maybe that was the secret destiny had been waiting to reveal. Some nights, when the city slept, she walked through wet streets, watching the golden reflections of streetlights on the pavement. She imagined herself on a grand stage, dressed in white, singing to a crowd that understood her. And for a brief moment, she believed it. But then the cold wind touched her skin, reminding her, she was just a waitress, no diploma, no connections, no powerful last name. Even so, the dream endured. It was like a candle refusing to go out in the middle of a storm. There were days when the customers' looks hurt more than words. Some ignored her with elegance, others with disdain. The humiliation didn't come through shouting, but through calculated silences, the kind that make you question your own existence. "You brought the wrong wine. You took too long. Don't touch my coat." Small stabs of superiority. And she, with her heart pounding, only answered, "I'm sorry, sir." Then went back to quietly humming, because singing was the only way to keep from losing herself completely. Time seemed to move slowly inside that dining room. Each night was the same as the last, the same forced laughter, the same background music, the same rushed orders. But something felt different that Friday night. A strange premonition. A sense that something unseen was moving among the crystal glasses and fancy dishes. Maybe destiny was peeking through the curtains, ready to turn the page of Amelie Porter's story. As she gathered napkins and arranged the glasses, a group of loud executives entered the room. Among them was a tall man in an expensive suit with an arrogant smile, the kind of gaze that turns people into numbers. Amelie noticed him briefly, not realizing that this encounter would change everything. It was just another night at Le Jardin Bleu, but destiny was already rehearsing a new song. Around 9 o'clock, the energy in the restaurant shifted. The famous Rick Dalton had arrived. He was known as much for his talent as for his arrogance. A millionaire, owner of record labels, and a man with a razor-sharp tongue, Rick had a gift for turning artists into brands, and people into products. His reputation floated through the industry like both legend and warning. Wherever he went, someone rose, and someone fell. When he entered, the youngest waiter whispered to Amelie, "That's the TV producer, the one who made that New York singer cry live on air." She just nodded, trying to stay invisible, as she always did. Rick settled at the most central table, demanding attention as if the entire restaurant existed to serve him. The waiters tripped over themselves to please him, laughing at everything he said, even the unfunny jokes. The air felt heavier. From a distance, Amelie watched. There was something in his eyes, a cold glint, the kind you only see in people who've spent too long looking down on others. Men like that love to hear themselves more than they love to listen, she thought, remembering how her boss used to say clients like him were good for business, bad for the soul. As she adjusted the silverware, Amelie found herself quietly humming again, an old habit since childhood. It was how she released the tension, how she survived boredom and pain. But the soft, sweet sound of her voice drifted across the room and reached Rick's ears. He turned his head, curious, then laughed. A sharp, mocking laugh, the kind that leaves no room for respect. "If you can really sing in French, I'll give you a contract," he shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. Laughter spread through the room like dry grass catching fire. The guests laughed, the waiters froze, and the manager pretended not to notice. Amelie felt her face burn. It wasn't the first time she'd been laughed at, but this humiliation was different. Maybe because it came from someone powerful, someone who represented the world that had always ignored her. She took a deep breath, trying not to tremble. "Excuse me, sir," she murmured, turning away to continue working. But inside her, something cracked, and something else awakened. Rick's laughter echoed for seconds that felt like minutes. And while he delighted in his own cruelty, Amelie thought of how many times her mother had been mocked for her accent, how many times her father had been treated as if being foreign were a crime. It wasn't just a joke, it was an open wound. She lowered her eyes, not to hide, but to conceal what was being born within her, a quiet flame of defiance. One of her co-workers approached, trying to comfort her with a weak smile. "Forget it, that's just how he is." Amelie only replied, "Some people laugh because they've never had to swallow their own pride." Her voice was low but sharp. No one noticed, but her silence carried weight, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Rick continued his night as if nothing had happened, savoring his wine and his ego. The restaurant returned to its usual noise, but for Amelie, nothing felt the same. The humiliation still throbbed, pulsing with a mix of anger and shame. Deep down, she knew, sometimes God writes destiny with the ink of pain. And maybe this was the beginning of a story that would change everything. As she cleared glasses from the next table, she glanced at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. There was something new in her eyes, a spark of determination, the kind that appears when someone realizes they have nothing left to lose. "They think they humiliated me," she thought. "But maybe they just set me free." Without realizing it, she made herself a silent promise. That laugh would be the last one at her expense. The rest of the night crawled by, every second dragging like glass inside her chest. Yet, through the pain and anger, something began to grow, an old longing, a secret she had never named. It was the desire to be heard, to show that her voice had worth. Not for revenge, but for dignity. And when Rick Dalton raised his glass for another loud toast, Amélie whispered softly, in French, "The world will hear me someday, monsieur." And in that silent sentence, whispered among plates and shadows, destiny smiled. Because, without knowing it, Amélie was about to turn humiliation into a stage, and mockery into music. The clock had barely struck 10 when the manager, sweating and nervous, burst into the dining room shouting for someone who could sing. The lead singer of the local band hadn't shown up, and the impatient guests were starting to complain. "This will ruin our reputation," he grumbled. Then, in the middle of the chaos, his eyes landed on Amélie. "Hey, girl, you're always humming around here, aren't you? Want to save the rich folks' dinner?" He joked, trying to hide his desperation. The timid laughter of her co-workers echoed through the room, but Amélie froze. It was the kind of invitation that was born out of a joke, not a real chance. Even so, something inside her answered before her mind could. Maybe it was time to take back what the world had stolen from her, her voice. The whole restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Rick Dalton, still seated at his table, raised an eyebrow and murmured something to his friends, laughing again. Amélie saw it from afar. And right there, in that moment, the spark lit by humiliation turned into fire. "Why not?" she thought. "If they're going to laugh, let them, but I'll show them something their laughter will never reach." The waitress adjusted her hair, removed her apron, and climbed the few steps to the small stage in the corner of the restaurant. With every step, her heartbeat pounded like a war drum. The microphone was old, the stand slightly bent, and the lights felt more threatening than welcoming. But Amélie didn't notice any of that. All she could hear was the sound of her own blood rushing and the faint murmurs of the crowd. The tension in the air had a metallic taste, as if destiny itself were sharpening a blade. "You can start whenever you're ready," said the manager, trying to sound confident. And then, the world stopped. The first notes of La Vie en Rose escaped her lips as if they had come from another time, another place. Her voice, soft yet steady, floated through the air, filling every empty corner of the room. The French words, gentle, poetic, melancholic, seemed to open windows in the souls of those who listened. It was impossible not to feel it. Even the most distracted waiter froze mid-motion, tray suspended in the air. What came out of her mouth wasn't just singing, it was healing, courage, the reminder of everything a wounded heart can still turn into beauty. Rick, who had been laughing moments before, now sat in silence. With every verse, the mockery on his face melted away, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years, admiration. Amélie wasn't singing for him, or even for the audience. She was singing for all the voices the world had silenced. For the mother who had taught her the language of love. For all the invisible Amélie's who clean tables and carry dreams. Her voice trembled, but not from fear, it trembled with truth. And truth is the one thing even the most arrogant cynic recognizes when they hear it. The next few minutes were a blend of pain and enchantment. It was as if every lyric opened a wound, and at the same time, healed it. Some guests, used to ignoring anything that doesn't shine, quietly wiped their eyes. Others just stared, hypnotized, trying to understand how so much strength could live inside such a small frame. That petite black woman, with tired hands, was doing the impossible, turning humiliation into art. At the back of the room, the sound of a glass breaking snapped the spell for a second. A waiter, wide-eyed, had dropped a plate. But Amélie didn't notice. She kept singing, eyes closed, soul wide open. The pain that once suffocated her had now become wings. And the stage, once a place that belonged to others, finally belonged to her. When the song ended, the silence that followed wasn't emptiness, it was reverence. No one dared to applaud right away. It was as if everyone needed a moment to return from wherever she had taken them. Rick, still seated, seemed paralyzed. A faint shine gathered in his eyes, and for the first time in years, he was speechless. Amélie opened her eyes slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply took a deep breath, like someone reclaiming air after years of holding it in. Inside her chest, the feeling was clear. Something had changed. The world had heard her. And even if she didn't fully understand it yet, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. That night, beneath the soft lights and stunned gazes, a new story began to write itself. What was meant to be an improvisation became the most unforgettable moment of everyone's lives. Little did they know, a recording of that performance would circle the world before sunrise. The entire dining hall seemed frozen in time. The candles flickered, the clinking of silverware ceased, and for an instant, the world bowed before that voice. The woman who once cleaned tables was now cleaning souls. Some tried to resist the emotion, but there was no defense against it. The waiter serving table 4 dropped his dish and, embarrassed, placed a hand over his heart. An elegant woman in silk covered her face, crying without knowing why. Amelie's voice moved through the room like a prayer disguised as a song, the kind of prayer that doesn't need words to make the heart kneel. When the final verse echoed, the silence that followed was so deep you could hear people breathing. No one knew whether to clap or to pray. Rick Dalton, the same man who had mocked her, remained still. The tears in his eyes betrayed something he'd buried long ago: shame. He, the man used to manufacturing stars, was now just an audience before something that can't be manufactured: truth. The waitress he'd humiliated minutes earlier had completely disarmed him, with a simplicity no amount of money could buy. The first clap came hesitantly, almost afraid to break the spell. Then, another. And another. Until the entire room stood up, an explosion of applause, tears, and awe. Amelie looked around, dazed, not quite understanding what had just happened. For a moment, she thought she must still be dreaming, but the sound of applause was far too real. Her co-workers exchanged looks, some crying, others smiling. The manager, stunned, just shook his head and whispered, "My God, what was that?" Across the room, Rick rose slowly. The arrogant grin was gone. In its place was something new: humility. "That woman," he murmured, unable to finish the sentence. His friends tried to speak, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. Amelie glanced at him briefly. There was no anger in her eyes, only calm strength, the kind that said everything. "The stage you tried to use to humiliate me now belongs to me." Rick swallowed hard, feeling, for the first time, the full weight of his own cruelty. The next morning, the name Amelie Porter was everywhere. The video, recorded by an anonymous customer, spread like fire in dry wind. The caption was simple but powerful: "The black waitress who sang and made New Orleans cry." Within hours, social media was in an uproar. Journalists called the restaurant, TV stations wanted interviews, and even local radio stations played the raw cell phone recording, imperfect, yet magical. At last, the world was hearing what she had always had to say. When Amelie arrived at the restaurant the next day, she could barely get through the door. A crowd had gathered outside, trying to see her, take pictures, thank her. "You reminded me of my mother," said an elderly woman through tears. "Your voice healed me," said another. The manager, still dazed, kept repeating, "I've never seen anything like this." Amelie, humble as ever, still wore her same light blue uniform, her hands trembling, her heart struggling to grasp the size of what had just begun. And there he was again, Rick Dalton, standing by the door, changed. The expensive suit was the same, but his eyes were not. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice hoarse. Amelie hesitated, then listened. I was wrong. I didn't recognize what I saw. You have something I can't explain." It was strange to see that man, the symbol of power and vanity, now so small before her. For a moment, she thought about walking away. But she didn't. Some lessons aren't taught through revenge, they're revealed through grace. Photographers captured the moment Rick extended his hand, and Amelie, unhurried, took it. It was more than a gesture. It was the world turning, returning to her what had once been stolen. The manager watched in disbelief, as if witnessing a miracle. And in a way, it was, because when truth sings, even pride must fall silent. In the following days, the restaurant became a pilgrimage site. People from all over came to see the woman who made New Orleans cry. The small stage at Le Jardin Bleu was never the same again. The lights, once indifferent, now seemed alive. The seats filled with people longing to feel what the video had shown, that rare purity, that sound born not from ego but from the soul. And Amélie, though she still didn't understand the full scope of it all, simply gave thanks in silence. She knew the secret of her strength lay in what others had tried to erase, her pain. It was humiliation that had shaped her courage. It was disdain that had refined her voice. And maybe that was the hidden miracle, turning what hurts into something that heals. As she sang on those nights that followed, she saw in the audience's tears reflections of her own. And she understood, some wounds never close, they turn into art. But destiny wasn't done with her show. Something greater still awaited, something that would put Amélie before a choice that would change not only her life but the lives of many. Days after the video went viral, Amélie found herself surrounded by offers. Record labels, producers, journalists, everyone wanted a piece of her story. But among all the smiling faces and rehearsed promises, she learned quickly, not every applause comes from a sincere heart. Rick Dalton, the same man who once humiliated her, returned with a formal proposal. A contract, management, tours, figures that could make anyone's hands shake. But Amélie was no longer the girl who cleaned tables afraid of being seen. She was now a woman who had learned, in the hardest way possible, that true wealth lies in the power to choose. "I'll sign," she said firmly. "But on one condition." Rick frowned. "Condition?" "Yes. I want to create a free music program for young Black and Latino kids with talent but no opportunity." Silence filled the room. He looked at her, surprised, maybe even ashamed. "There's no profit in that," he said. Amélie smiled, calm, steady, full of purpose. "Not everything that's valuable can be sold." That was the moment he realized he wasn't just standing before a rare voice, but a woman who had turned her wounds into strength. The months that followed were a whirlwind. The project began in a small warehouse in Tremé, where bright-eyed, insecure young people started discovering the power of their own voices. Amélie called them, "my little thunderclouds." She knew what it was like to have your talent locked away, and she wanted to break every cage. Her success grew, awards, magazine covers, international tours, but her essence stayed the same. "I don't sing to be heard," she said. "I sing so others discover they can too." The public gave her a new name, the Black Rose of New Orleans. The nickname came from a music critic who wrote, "While other artists chase the spotlight, she blooms in the shadows." And it fit perfectly. Because every one of her performances reminded people that beauty isn't born from perfection. It grows from the courage to exist, even when the world tries to erase you. In her shows, she wore simple dresses, often with a single rose tucked in her hair, a symbol of everything that blooms after pain. One night, at the city's grandest theater, Amélie stepped onto the stage before thousands. The lights dimmed, the audience waited for the familiar opening of La Vie en Rose. With a serene smile, she said, "Once, they laughed at me for singing in French. Today, I sing to remind everyone, no voice is born small. The world just needs to learn how to listen." The audience rose before she even sang a note. It wasn't just a concert, it was a celebration of restored dignity. Among those in the crowd sat Rick Dalton, silent in the front row. He had learned from Amélie a lesson money could never buy. Success without purpose is only vanity in disguise. When she noticed him, she gave a small wave, not of resentment, but of gratitude. Because without that moment of humiliation, she might never have discovered her own strength. Rick, moved, stood and applauded, eyes wet, finally understanding the meaning of redemption. The next day, newspapers ran headlines that moved the nation. From Invisible Waitress to the Black Rose, the woman who made the world listen. But for Amélie, nothing meant more than the light in the eyes of the kids from her project. In their trembling voices, she saw herself reflected. Every off-key note was an act of courage, every smile a victory over silence. "They are my real contract," she said proudly. Over time, her name became a symbol of hope. In every city she performed, she left behind seeds, small schools, workshops, opportunities. And when people asked where her strength came from, she answered simply, "From humiliation. It taught me never to doubt my worth." The audience would applaud, unaware that behind every verse still lived scars. Scars she had learned to turn into melody. Today, Amelie is more than a singer, she's a symbol. The invisible girl became a bridge between worlds. Her story became a lesson that destiny can be cruel, but courage is always greater. And at every show, when the theater fills with light, one truth remains. The stage became her altar, and the voice the world once tried to silence now echoes into eternity. And if this story touched your heart, like the video, like and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Because who knows, maybe the next invisible voice waiting to be heard is yours.